like to welcome everyone here at Family Life Church in the newly remodeled Chapel Cafe. And this panel discussion is to take place to fulfill the Liberty University's doctoral program. And we're going to be hosting a panel discussion, and we're going to be discussing together historical practices today. And we're going to be looking at solving a problem. And here's the problem. The problem is that Faith Presbyterian Church in Hermitage, Pennsylvania does not have clear criteria for electing elders to serve on the board. So we have several questions to help resolve that problem. And before we do that, we have a wonderful group of folks here, and we're going to start and introduce ourselves. And we'll start over at the end with Chris.
My name is Chris Massey. I am the lead pastor here at Family Life Church. I've been in ministry for 20 years. This is the second senior pastor position that I've served in. Prior to that, I served 10 years as a youth pastor.
We're glad you're here.
Thank you.
My name is Russ Shellock. I'm a retired detective from New York. I've served on governing boards of a couple of churches cumulatively for about 14 years. Currently, I'm on the board at Christian Missionary Alliance in New Wilmington, Pennsylvania.
My name is Deborah Zippe. I worked for 31 years as an administrative assistant at the Sharpsville School District. I am married to my best friend for almost 50 years come this August. We have 2 sons and 2 grandsons. I have been a member of Faith Presbyterian Church for about 17 years. I have served as a deacon and an elder. Currently, I'm serving a member of Presbyterian Women, Craft Day, Needlework, and Women's Fellowship Bible Study. I have also served on the following committees in the past: Nurture, Evangelism, Mission, Vacation Bible School, Sunday School, and I currently sing in the choir.
My name's John Burkett. I'm a member of Faith Presbyterian Church. I've served on the Board of Elders. My last term ended a year ago, and I'm actually going to go back on this for this next 3 years. I was installed today. So I grew up in our church, been there probably for the last almost 30 years. Grew up in our youth program, and just want to continue to help out and see our church continue to thrive.
Thank you for being here. Well, with that, we'll jump right into it. You all have the questions before you. I trust you've taken some time to think through them. We'll start with the first question. So you all have just indicated that you are all serving on boards or currently serving on boards. What would you say are the most important character traits for someone serving in this capacity? If you don't mind, I'd like to start things off with Russ.
I personally think that integrity is obviously one of the main traits. In 1 Timothy, he talks about how you have to be above reproach, and I think that's absolutely true. I'm just going to give you 3 traits for me, and then I'll go through a little explanation. Integrity, confidence, which not just self-confidence, but also spiritual maturity, I mean by that. And of course, humility, because you're serving God. Everything has to be not about you and not about selfish attainment. As far as integrity, I mean, I served on a board where some of the members would get on the board really just more for their own selfish gain, for what they wanted to see happen with the church, as opposed to actually doing what was best for the church or leading the church. And when their purpose was attained, then their agenda was reached, they kind of dropped off and stopped coming to meetings and stuff, and that becomes an issue too frequently, I think. Also, as far as confidence, we're in a search for a pastor right now. We're actually just completed one at the church that I'm on the board right now for, and everybody, it's too easy for people, if you don't have confidence and spiritual maturity to be guiding properly, to just sway with what everybody else wants or what everybody's saying on the board, as opposed to actually putting putting your foot down and saying what you actually think needs to be, you know, what the actual goal is, and to actually attain the purpose and the guidance for the church instead of just doing what everybody else wants instead.
Mm-hmm.
And there's times as elders, you know, we're not just called to be, the pastor's not always there. Like right now we're in a pastor search. There's also times when the pastor's injured or, you know, can't be there. We're all supposed to be the ones that are praying for the congregation. If you don't have that kind of confidence and that spiritual maturity to help the congregation is a difficult task.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Who else would like to answer that question?
I have a couple things. I had the same things as he did, and then I also had spiritually mature. I think is one of the most important ones. But you need to be alert, watchful. You need to be approachable from the eyes of the congregation. Let them come to you if there's an issue or a problem that needs to be addressed by the session. You should be self-controlled, hospitable. 1 Peter chapter 5 verses 1 and 2, to be examples for others to follow and to set church policy. Those things are so important that you need to have a clear head and work very well with the other session members.
Chris, as a pastor, and are you resonating with what the folks have said so far?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the other thing I might add, and when you had mentioned this, Russ, the confidence issue, definitely brought to my mind confidentiality is huge, because you're dealing with a lot of things as a board that, you know, part of that, and it's not to say that it's to keep it from the church, but it's your responsibility as the elders to handle those situations, make decisions that have to be made. And unfortunately, I've seen firsthand witness, you know, a number of times when that confidentiality was breached. And I could share stories later if needed be, but when that confidentiality gets breached, it can do a lot of damage to the whole, you know, the whole church, the board, just the reputation of the board, all of it. So that's important.
How far does your confidentiality go? Is this, if you're on the board, it doesn't leave here? Or is this, you know, something you can share within your own household? How does that work here?
I mean, I certainly don't tell people you're not allowed to say this to your spouse or something like that, but I will lead by example, and letting the board know there are times and places where it's my responsibility, not just as the pastor, but as a husband, to not bring things to my wife that are going to be a detriment to her spiritual walk, the way that she sees the people of the church. I have a responsibility to shield her from that. I've had situations where, you know, there were people who got hurt, and I've had to tell them quite frankly, if something happens in these meetings that hurts your spouse, it's your fault. Because you need to be responsible for that information, and if you're sharing it outside of this room, even with your spouse, and it brings hurt to them, that's on you. You know, you did that. So that's where I think that confidentiality is very important.
Mm-hmm. Very insightful. Thank you. John, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think everything that everyone said was on point. One of the things that I guess I wrote down here in thinking about this, I've always felt that it's important for people to, like Chris said, it needs to be a confidential enough atmosphere that everybody can freely speak their mind.
Mm-hmm.
Then the individuals need to be confident enough to speak their mind, and like Russ said, stand up for what you believe. I mean, that's what you're there for. If you take it out to the parking lot and share it with somebody else out in the parking lot, you didn't do the church at large a favor by withholding that opinion when you could have furthered the discussion and dealt with that in the room. So I think that's just being open and diplomatic enough to be able to hash things out in those session meetings. That's an important thing.
And I think as Deb kind of alluded as well, that spiritual maturity, because you're going to disagree with the people in the room, but you have to have the spiritual maturity that once the meeting is over, we're going to agree on what we do from here. You know, even if it wasn't what I voted for, if it wasn't my position, we as a whole, in order to safeguard the unity of the body, are going to be on board moving forward with what the decisions are. And that takes spiritual maturity.
Very well said. Well, very good. So moving along, we have different denominations represented here. And so just briefly, if you can touch upon what process does your organization use to select elders to serve on the board? And maybe, Deb, if you can speak to that
Sure.
from Presbyterian viewpoint, and I know Russ, you have the Alliance viewpoint, and then Chris, you'll have a different one. But just briefly, bring us up to speed on how that process works.
We follow basically the Book of Order, whereby we appoint a nominating committee. The nominating committee gathers and goes through the photo book and goes through all the membership and decides who to ask. And they do ask people if they are willing to be an elder. Then they give that slate to the congregation at the January congregational meeting, and they are voted on.
And we have 3 elders that rotate on and off. So the nominating committee is responsible to choose 3 elders and 3 deacons.
Correct.
Every year. Russ, what is it like in the Alliance Church?
In our church, what we do is, we take, our board is small, and we basically are the nominating committee. The congregation and the elders will talk about who to recommend, who to nominate, and then we sit down at a board meeting, the elders do, and we discuss people's maturity, spiritual maturity level, their criteria basically, and then we will talk to each individual person for a little while, just to give them a basic idea of what the responsibilities will be, what it actually entails, some pros and some cons, and then we mandate that they wait a little while before they make a decision, so they have time to take it all in, filter it, and decide if it's really something they want to get involved in.
So follow-up question for you, because I know how our system works, and I've spent enough time with Chris to know this answer. What is the pastor's role in that process?
Our pastor worked with each individual person also, and kind of made himself open to talk to everyone about, like I said, what the responsibilities are, what it entails. Because too frequently, I think people get involved, don't know exactly what they're getting involved in, and then they say, a couple months into it, they're like, "Whoa, that's not what I expected." And now they're getting all the dirt from the church, and it pulls them away and tears them,
Yes.
So they have to be kind of made aware of that in advance, because it's something that happens inevitably,
So in our process, our pastor is not involved at all. In fact, I don't think for the whole time I've been a member at the church, our pastor has never been involved in the process of finding new elders.
Now take that and now contrast this with how they do things at Chris's church.
So we're part of the Assemblies of God, denominationally speaking. It's a little different, I think, than a lot of other denominations. The verbiage that they use is that each of the churches is a voluntary cooperative fellowship. So there are no overriding rules or regulations that would dictate how each individual church is going to handle their election process. I've been a part of 4 churches that I could probably speak to. All 4 of them do it differently. Ranging from, I'll say the worst one I've ever seen, we have an annual business meeting. At that business meeting, they say, okay, now it's time to call out nominations for people who are going to serve on the board for the next 2 years. Literally, somebody says a name. Okay, John Doe, are you willing to serve? Yes, I'm willing. Okay, you're going to be on the ballot. I've seen that. Literally, that was at my former church. That's how they did it before I got there. Our process here is each year at our annual business meeting, we nominate a nominating committee. So from the floor, we nominate names and ask, will you serve next year as a member of the nominating committee? It makes 5 members of the congregation, and then there will be 3 members of the board who are part of that process. About a week ago, I met with that group and furnished them with all of the eligible members of our church that have served, been members for 2 years in good standing, all those things. They can make nominations from there. At which point I received those 8 papers back with all those nominations on them. It is my responsibility to know a little bit more behind the scenes about those families. Is this a good fit? Are they a good nomination? Are there any things that I might be aware of that might be a breach of confidentiality for me to share as to why this person might not be in a good position to serve right now? From there, we notify each individual that they have been nominated, ask them, as Russ said, to take some time to pray about it, think about it, and get back to us. And then we furnish those names to the people of the church about a week before the meeting will take place to ask them to think and pray about it before we actually vote in a meeting.
So you're more involved
Much more.
than, I would say, maybe even guessing from the other 3 on the panel.
Yeah. And I've been a part of, or I shouldn't say I've been a part of, I know of other churches where, and I would honestly consider this a more biblical pathway, the pastor appoints his own board members. And it is the church's responsibility, they have ratification power. So basically the pastor appoints who the board's members of his board are going to be. The name is submitted before the members of the church, and they get the decision whether or not to approve or reject that person. And at the one church I remember talking to, it was like it had to be a 2/3 majority that approved of that nomination for the pastor to do that.
Yeah, that's it's fascinating to me to see how church culture changes from denomination to denomination. It seems that there are, strengths and weaknesses to all these different models. But it's something that I think hopefully through this process we can all learn and tighten things up at our own churches. The whole focus of this first panel discussion is to look at historical practices. So with that in mind, I was wondering, in the past, what were the most important qualities a person could have that would get them selected to serve on the board? Now I realize that some of us are a little bit younger, so maybe just things that you've heard or might imagine would have been a high value back in the day, or maybe you've experienced. But I'm wondering, looking back, what were those qualities previously that would have gotten someone selected to the board? I don't know who'd like to go first.
I can go first. I think the what we call them as elders is kind of descriptive of what that role is. They're supposed to be people that have some experience and some worldly experience to be able to contribute. They've done other things in their life, or other types of service that they can come onto that board and be, have some wisdom to go along with the church that they're trying to lead.
I also have, and I know this was when I first joined the church, some of the criteria was if you attend church regularly. Our adult Sunday school classes are a very big and important part of our church, and an elder they really look to see if you were attending Sunday school, adult Sunday school. To be honest, to be self-disciplined, exercise leadership, and have spiritual discernment. Those were a lot of the ones when I first joined.
But they weren't necessarily overt. These were just embedded beliefs that people had.
Correct.
What else?
I know, speaking from past experience, participation was a big part, like you were saying with the Sunday school, but the people that would come to any of the events, like the spaghetti dinners and any kind of event, that fundraisers they were doing, people that would help out with that would usually be, kind of an unwritten rule that those were the people that would be.
Exercise leadership.
Yep. Yeah, because it shows you're concerned, you have dedication, you have loyalty, and
you're willing.
You're showing that you're a stakeholder, yeah.
Right.
I would say historically, from what I've seen anyway, there have been times and places where you had to have a certain last name to be able to serve on the board. To be fair, you had to have a certain gender to be able to serve on a board. I know, and this is something, at least I can speak for the Assemblies of God, that they relaxed about 15, 20 years ago. You could not be divorced in order to serve on the board. You had to have, only been married once and to the same person for your entire life. So I think, those are some of the things that have changed over the years. Obviously, not all denominations permit women to serve on boards. The Assemblies of God, we do. And then there are also, I guess they made an exception a number of years ago that if your divorce was prior to conversion, then that could be a reason for you to, hey, now that you've been saved, you're covered by the blood of Jesus, and that past is no longer you. That's one of the ways they kind of have gone around that.
What about, we're talking about looking for people who have been invested. Do any of your churches consider donations, contributing monetary wise? It's okay if they don't. It's just more out of curiosity. I see Chris is shaking his head.
Oh yeah,
yes.
we, without a doubt, when I get that nominating list, I do not keep record of who gives or who does not give in the church. I don't think that's a good way for me to lead, because I want to lead without knowledge of who gives and who doesn't. But I do ask my associate pastor to investigate and let me know if we do not have a record of any individual who's been nominated as giving to the church, then they would be off that list.
For the same philosophical idea of you vote with your feet. You're not invested here.
Invested, yes, but you're also not being biblically responsible, and we have a biblical responsibility to tithe and give to the Lord. If you're not being obedient with your own finances, it seems poor stewardship to allow you to be over the finances of the church.
It would be the Martin Luther quote, where you show your calendar and your checkbook, right?
Mm-hmm. That sounds
Yes.
familiar to me.
Sounds familiar.
That does sound familiar.
A couple more questions, if we can get through them.
Can I
we have about-
interject on that one just for 1 second? The only thing I have about that would bring a question, well, not a question. Obviously you normally would tithe to the church you're going to also.
Mm-hmm.
However, like my parents were big givers my whole life. I grew up in a Christian home. I have, it was the way my family was.
Mm-hmm.
And they always gave to the church, but they didn't give phenomenally to our church or, any overabundant, but they gave to so many different things. They tithed a lot of places, and it wasn't necessarily to our church in a big number. So that's just something to consider, because we aren't necessarily privileged to where people are tithing or where their money's going,
Yeah, I guess from a polity standpoint, we differentiate even between tithes and offerings. So the tithe goes into, by definition, the house where you're being served and fed and ministered to. That's where the tithe goes. And the offering goes to, you can give offerings up to anywhere. But again, all of it is kind of fluid, because it's not like we ask for W-2s. I have if we just have a regular record of that person giving, that's going to be, we're not sitting there with a calculator like, well, I bet they make more than $48,000 a year and they only gave $4,800 last year. But I do understand what you're saying, Russ.
Are you suggesting maybe in some of the future panels we talk about that, Chris? Is that
But I agree with Russ. I've seen it in our church where I don't know what families tithe, but I know that there are activities that happen, maybe Sunday school, vacation Bible school, different things that people purchase items to help that activity, but they don't get reimbursed. So I understand
And my parents were always kind of guarded with that, so they would usually, when they were giving to our church, they would give in cash. They wouldn't, because they weren't worried about getting a tax exempt letter at the end of the year. They wanted, it's a tithe. It wasn't, something they're doing.
And a lot of people over the years, don't let your left hand see what your right hand is doing.
Right.
To the tune of, I'm only going to give cash. I don't want there to be any record.
Right.
And I understand that position as well.
So I think one of the things we can take away from this conversation is the question is in the past, what were the most important qualities a person would have to get elected on the board? I think the word maybe would just be investment. They're invested. You vote with your feet. You're giving your money, you're putting your money where your mouth is, in a sense, that you're invested there. You know, when the doors are open to the church, you're there. Maybe not every time, but by and large, you know, you're there. You're helping contribute in various ways. I think we have time for maybe one more question.
If I could just throw in one extra thing, I guess, I mean, finances is important, but another thing I'm always looking for is that servant's heart. Like, are they somebody that's showing up to our men's breakfast, or, you know, our VBS, or we have a work day and they're coming to help, or a serve day out in our community? So investment financially, but also from that servant's heart position. Like, how often are you being a part of what we're doing here in ministry as well?
I think we have time for one more question. All right, so the question that I'm going to choose for us to finish up with is, in the past, historically, what would you say that your system leaned more heavily on? Would you say biblical standards or practical standards while electing elders? And I think we can just we'll start with Chris and move right through everyone, and with John, then we'll wrap up the panel.
Sure. I kind of hold the viewpoint that we don't typically, in America anyway, appoint members of deacon boards and elder boards in a biblical manner. We do it from a democratic standpoint through voting. And that's really, there's nowhere in Scripture where we see that taking place, that we ask the leaders to go before the entire congregation to be voted on. Now, we do see when the apostles had to appoint another apostle, they took a vote among themselves as to who was going to fill that other role. But I would say historically we have leaned much more towards a practical standpoint, and to some extent we think governmentally in regards to our church boards as well, as almost like they're meant to serve as a checks and balances. Like, the board is here to make sure that the pastor doesn't take the church off the rails, and if he makes decisions that are not good for the church, the board's going to rein that back in. And that's not really a biblical viewpoint either. I mean, the real purpose in Acts 6:4, when they began to appoint elder boards, is they said, we have too much going on in ministry and we need to appoint elders who can oversee the stuff that we're doing so that we have time to continue to pray and to preach. And so really what their goal was to be an extension and to fulfill that responsibility. So I don't think in America we really grasp that. We feel much more comfortable of, I get a vote, my vote matters, and the people who are on that board can keep the pastor in check from not doing anything that would be off the rails, if you will.
I think for the sake of time, we're going to wrap it up there. I know we could have spent more time discussing that, and maybe in the future we can get together back at the Chapel Cafe and have more coffee. But I want to thank you all for your time. This was very fruitful, and I think we just started answering some important historical practices that'll help all of us, you know, as we move forward when selecting elders on the board. So I want to thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to our next panel discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.